I stood in my childhood bedroom at 32, holding a sealed envelope marked "Private for Irma only" that the family lawyer had just handed me after my father's funeral. My stepmother, Diane, was calling from downstairs about dividing Dad's belongings. The envelope contained a cashier's check for $6 million and a handwritten note. "Irma, this is from selling the patents I never told anyone about. Don't let Diane know until you understand who she really is." My hands shook as I heard Diane's footsteps approaching the stairs. "Irma, sweetie, are you okay up there?" Diane's voice carried the same trembling quality it had held throughout the funeral service. I quickly stuffed the envelope into my old college textbook and turned toward the doorway where she appeared, her eyes still puffy and red from crying. "I'm fine, just looking through some old memories," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady while my heart pounded against my ribs. Diane stepped into the room, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. At 58, she still maintained the graceful posture that had first caught Dad's attention 3 years ago. But today she looked fragile, almost breakable. Her usually perfect auburn hair hung loose around her face, and her makeup had been completely washed away by tears. "I don't know how I'm going to manage without him," she whispered, sinking onto the edge of my old twin bed. "Robert was everything to me. We had such plans for retirement, for traveling together. Now I'm completely lost." The raw pain in her voice made my chest tighten with guilt. Here I was hiding a life-changing inheritance while she grieved the man who had been her world for the past 3 years. Dad had married Diane when I was 29, just 2 years after Mom's death from breast cancer. At first, I'd resented this elegant woman who seemed to glide into our lives, but watching her care for Dad during his final months had softened my heart. "Diane, you're not alone. I'm here and we'll figure everything out together," I said, sitting beside her on the narrow mattress. She leaned against my shoulder, and I could smell the lavender perfume she always wore. "I'm so scared, Irma. The medical bills from Robert's treatment drained everything we had saved. I might lose this house, the place where he was happiest. I don't even know where I'll go." My stomach twisted into knots. Dad's cancer treatment had been extensive and expensive, involving experimental therapies not covered by insurance. I'd seen the stress on both their faces as bills accumulated, watched Dad worry about leaving Diane financially secure. "What about Dad's life insurance?" I asked gently. "There was a small policy through his old engineering job, but it barely covers the funeral expenses and remaining medical debt." Diane replied, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Your father was always so private about money. He handled all our finances, said he didn't want me worrying about such things. Now I realize how foolish that was. I thought about my own modest savings account still recovering from my divorce settlement 6 months earlier. I'd moved back home to help care for Dad during his illness, taking a leave of absence from my software engineering job in Denver. My ex-husband had left me with minimal resources after our split, but surely I could help Diane through this difficult transition. Listen, I have some money set aside. It's not much, but I can help with the mortgage payments until we figure out a long-term solution," I offered. Diane pulled back to look at me, her green eyes wide with surprise. "Oh, Irma, I couldn't possibly accept that. You've already given up so much to be here with us these past few months." "You're family now," I insisted. "Dad would want us to take care of each other." She embraced me tightly, her shoulders shaking with renewed sobbing. "You're the daughter I always wanted but never had. Robert talked about you constantly, how proud he was of your intelligence and independence. He always said you inherited his analytical mind." As I held my stepmother, my thoughts kept drifting to the hidden envelope and Dad's cryptic warning. What had he meant about understanding who Diane really was? The woman crying in my arms seemed genuinely devastated, completely lost without her husband's guidance and support. Over the next hour, Diane and I sorted through Dad's personal belongings in his bedroom. She shared intimate stories about their relationship, showing me photos from their honeymoon cruise to Alaska and their recent anniversary dinner at the steakhouse where they'd had their first date. "He was so romantic," she said, holding up a pressed flower from a bouquet he'd given her. Even during the worst of his illness, he'd leave little love notes on my pillow. I saved every single one. She opened a small wooden box and showed me dozens of handwritten notes in Dad's familiar scrawl. Messages like, "Thank you for making me believe in love again," and "You're my sunshine on the darkest days," filled page after page. The tenderness in his words made my eyes burn with unshed tears. "He really loved you," I said softly. "And I loved him more than I thought possible," Diane replied. "When I married him, I'd almost given up on finding true happiness. My first husband died so young, and I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone. Robert saved me from that loneliness." As we continued organizing, Diane pulled out a folder of medical documents and insurance papers. I suppose I should try to understand all this financial information, though it's completely overwhelming. I offered to help her review everything, and we spread the papers across Dad's desk. Insurance claims, hospital bills, and prescription receipts painted a picture of mounting medical expenses over the past year. Everything seemed consistent with what I knew about Dad's cancer treatment. Then I noticed something odd. Tucked between two insurance forms was a hospital bill dated just 2 weeks ago, but Dad had died 3 weeks ago. The signature on the bill was Diane's, but it was for cosmetic surgery consultations, not cancer treatment. "Diane, what's this bill for?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She glanced at the paper and her face flushed slightly. "Oh, that must be a billing error. The hospital system has been completely mixed up since Robert's death. They keep sending duplicate bills and incorrect dates. I'll call them tomorrow to sort it out." Her explanation seemed reasonable, but something in her voice sounded different. Less natural, more rehearsed. I tucked the observation away in my mind, feeling increasingly confused about the conflicting messages I was receiving. As evening approached, Diane insisted on cooking dinner for both of us. "It helps keep my hands busy," she explained, "and Robert always said my lasagna was better than his mother's recipe." During our meal, I watched her carefully looking for any signs that might explain Dad's warning. But all I saw was a grieving widow struggling to hold herself together, occasionally breaking into quiet sobs between bites of food. "I just can't imagine what I'll do if I lose this house," she said suddenly. "All my memories with Robert are here. This kitchen where we cooked together, the living room where we watched old movies, the garden where he proposed. Without those connections, I'll lose him all over again." The desperation in her voice broke my heart, and I found myself promising to do whatever I could to help her keep the house. As she cleared our plates, I noticed her hands trembling, and I felt ashamed for doubting this woman who clearly adored my father. But as I prepared for bed that night, Dad's note kept echoing in my mind. Why would he warn me about Diane if she was exactly who she appeared to be? What secrets could this seemingly transparent woman possibly be hiding? The next morning, I woke to the sound of Diane moving around downstairs, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors with unusual energy. When I joined her in the kitchen, I was surprised to find her dressed in a sharp black business suit, her hair styled perfectly and her makeup applied with professional precision. "Good morning, dear," she said brightly, a stark contrast to the broken woman from the previous evening. I decided I need to start taking control of my situation. I have an appointment with Robert's financial advisor this afternoon. "That's a great idea," I replied, though something about her sudden transformation felt jarring. "Would you like me to come with you?" "Oh no, I need to learn to handle these things myself," she said quickly, "but thank you for offering. Independence is going to be crucial for my survival." As she bustled around the kitchen preparing breakfast, I noticed several shopping bags by the back door that hadn't been there the night before. When I mentioned them, Diane's face brightened. "I did some retail therapy early this morning," she admitted, looking slightly embarrassed. "I know it sounds terrible, but buying beautiful things makes me feel closer to Robert. He always encouraged me to treat myself well." She pulled items from the bags to show me an expensive silk scarf, a designer handbag, and a stunning gold bracelet that looked like it cost several $1,000s. For someone claiming financial desperation, these seemed like unusual purchases. "Diane, are you sure this is the best use of your resources right now?" I asked gently. Her expression shifted, becoming defensive. "These are grief purchases, Irma. When you lose someone you love, you'll understand the need to feel something other than emptiness. Robert would want me to find small moments of beauty during this horrible time." Her explanation made sense emotionally, but my analytical mind struggled with the contradiction between her claimed poverty and these luxury items. I decided to observe more carefully rather than voice additional concerns. Throughout the day, Diane's behavior continued to puzzle me. She spent long periods on phone calls, speaking in hushed tones and hanging up whenever I entered the room. When I asked about the conversations, she claimed to be coordinating with funeral home staff and insurance companies. "There are so many details to handle after someone dies," she explained. "Paperwork never ends." That afternoon, while Diane attended her financial meeting, I decided to review more of Dad's papers. In his home office, I discovered several documents that painted a concerning picture of their financial situation. According to bank statements, their joint savings account had been nearly depleted over the past 6 months, but not entirely by medical expenses. Large withdrawals appeared regularly, many for amounts that seemed excessive for household needs. Credit card statements showed expensive purchases at jewelry stores, high-end restaurants, and exclusive boutiques. The pattern suggested someone living far above their means despite mounting medical bills. When Diane returned from her appointment, her mood had shifted again. She seemed agitated and frustrated, pacing through the house with nervous energy. "How did the meeting go?" I asked. "Disappointing," she replied curtly. Apparently, Robert was even more secretive about his finances than I realized. The advisor claims he doesn't have complete information about all of Robert's assets. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her green eyes intense and focused. "Irma, did your father ever mention having accounts that I might not know about? Sometimes he would make comments about providing for the future that seemed to hint at hidden resources." The directness of her question caught me off guard. "Dad was always private about money," I said carefully, "even with me." "I understand that, but surely he might have shared something with his only child. Bank accounts, investments, maybe even a safety deposit box." Diane's tone had become almost interrogative. I shook my head, uncomfortable with the intensity of her questioning. If he had significant assets, wouldn't they have appeared in his will? "That's what makes this so frustrating," Diane said, running her hands through her hair. "I have this feeling that Robert was protecting something, keeping secrets even from me. His will was so simple, almost too simple for a man of his intelligence." Over dinner that evening, Diane continued probing about Dad's financial affairs. She mentioned several theories about where he might have hidden money, suggesting we search through his personal effects more thoroughly. "Sometimes men hide things in the most obvious places," she said. "Family photos, old books, even inside electronics. Your father was brilliant enough to outsmart conventional thinking." Her persistence made me increasingly uncomfortable. The grieving widow from 2 days ago had been replaced by someone almost obsessively focused on discovering hidden wealth. I began to understand why Dad might have felt the need to keep his inheritance secret. Later that evening, as I prepared for bed, I overheard Diane on another hushed phone conversation. She was speaking to someone she called Marcus, discussing what sounded like research strategies. "The daughter doesn't seem to know anything useful," she said quietly. "But Robert was too clever to leave everything out in the open. There has to be something more significant than what appeared in the will." I pressed my ear closer to the wall, trying to hear more of the conversation. "Maybe we need to be more creative in our approach," Diane continued. "The girl trusts me now. She's offered to help financially, which shows she has access to resources. Perhaps she knows more than she's revealing." My blood ran cold as the implications of her words sank in. This wasn't a conversation about legitimate financial concerns. This sounded like strategizing to extract information or resources from me. The next morning, I decided to investigate further. While Diane showered, I searched through her purse, feeling guilty, but increasingly concerned for my safety. Hidden in a side pocket, I found a business card for a private investigator specializing in asset location and inheritance research. The card had handwritten notes in Diane's elegant script, "Target Robert's hidden accounts," and "Daughter might know more than she admits." My hands trembled as I photographed the card with my phone and carefully returned it to its hiding place. Dad's warning suddenly made perfect sense. Diane wasn't just a grieving widow struggling with finances. She was actively hunting for hidden assets and had identified me as either a potential source of information or an obstacle to be managed. As I heard the shower turn off upstairs, I realized I was in potentially serious danger. The woman I'd been trying to help was studying me like a mark in some elaborate con game. Dad had tried to protect me with his cryptic note, but I'd been too naive to recognize the warning signs. Standing in the kitchen where Diane had prepared countless meals with apparent love and devotion, I finally understood that everything I'd witnessed might have been an elaborate performance. But if that was true, what else had she been faking? And more terrifyingly, what was she ultimately planning to do? I spent the next 2 days walking on eggshells pretending everything was normal, while internally processing the horrifying possibility that my stepmother might be far more dangerous than I'd imagined. On Wednesday morning, I called Dad's lawyer under the pretense of handling estate paperwork. "Mr. Patterson, I need to ask you something confidential about my father's final instructions," I said, keeping my voice low while Diane ran errands. "Of course, Irma. Your father was very specific about certain matters. What can I help clarify?" "The inheritance he left me came with a warning about Diane. Did he ever explain what he meant?" There was a long pause before Mr. Patterson responded. "Your father came to see me privately about 6 weeks before he passed. He'd been conducting some research that deeply concerned him." "What kind of research?" Robert had begun investigating Diane's background after noticing some inconsistencies in stories she'd told him. What he discovered frightened him enough that he wanted to ensure you were protected financially and warned about potential dangers. My heart hammered against my ribs. What did he find? "I probably shouldn't discuss details over the phone. Can you come to my office this afternoon? I have files your father left specifically for you to review if something happened to him." 3 hours later, I sat in Mr. Patterson's oak-paneled office staring at a manila folder marked Diane Confidential. Inside were photocopied documents, printed internet searches, and handwritten notes in Dad's meticulous engineering script. "Your father spent weeks researching Diane's history," Mr. Patterson explained. "What he discovered would disturb anyone." The first document was a marriage certificate from 1998 showing Diane married to someone named Thomas Wellington in Phoenix, Arizona. The second was Thomas's obituary from 2000, listing his cause of death as sudden cardiac arrest at age 62. "She's been married before." I said, though, that alone wasn't necessarily sinister. "Keep reading," Mr. Patterson advised grimly. The next set of documents showed another marriage certificate from 2002 in Sacramento, California. Diane married Harold Chen, a retired investment banker. Harold's obituary followed 2 years later, sudden illness survived by loving wife Diane. By the time I finished reviewing the folder, I'd found evidence of 4 previous marriages, each ending with the husband's unexpected death within 2 to 3 years of the wedding. Every man had been wealthy, recently widowed, and over 50 years old. "This can't be coincidental," I whispered. "Your father didn't think so either. Look at the medical information he managed to obtain." The final section contained copies of medical examiner reports from 2 of the deaths. While both had been ruled natural, the reports mentioned unusual toxin levels that couldn't be definitively explained. In Harold Chen's case, traces of digitalis appeared in his system, though he had no prescription for heart medication. Dad thought Diane was murdering her husbands. He suspected a pattern that law enforcement had never connected because the deaths occurred in different states with different medical examiners. Your father was brilliant enough to see connections others missed. I studied a timeline Dad had created showing how Diane moved from state to state, always remarrying within 6 months of her previous husband's death. Each time she inherited substantial assets before relocating and changing her identity slightly. How did Dad find all this information? He hired a private investigator after becoming suspicious about some of Diane's stories. The investigator traced her social security number and previous addresses. What they found was a 25-year pattern of predatory relationships. My mind raced back over the past 3 years, remembering how quickly Diane had integrated into Dad's life. She'd appeared at his grief counseling group just 3 months after Mom died, presenting herself as a widow seeking companionship. Dad, vulnerable and lonely, had been drawn to her grace and apparent vulnerability. Why didn't he confront her or contact police? He tried to gather enough evidence for authorities to take seriously, but proving murder from natural-sounding deaths is extremely difficult. Meanwhile, his health was declining rapidly. He suspected Diane might be accelerating his condition. The room seemed to spin around me. You think she was poisoning Dad, too? Your father believed so. He'd been experiencing symptoms that didn't match his cancer progression. Sudden weakness, heart palpitations, confusion episodes. His oncologist couldn't explain the symptom pattern. Mr. Patterson handed me another document. This is a hair sample your father collected and had tested privately. It showed trace amounts of compounds that shouldn't have been present. I stared at the lab report, understanding that Dad had been fighting for his life in ways I'd never realized. While I'd been admiring Diane's devoted caregiving, she might have been slowly killing him. There's more, Mr. Patterson continued. Your father installed hidden recording equipment in your family home. He wanted to document Diane's behavior when she thought she was unobserved. He handed me a small digital device. These are audio files from the 2 weeks before his death. I warn you, they're disturbing. I listened to the first recording with growing horror. It was Diane on the phone speaking to someone she called Marcus about accelerating Robert's timeline because the daughter is getting suspicious. We need to make his decline look natural, Diane's voice said clearly. The usual methods should work, but we need to be careful. His daughter is an engineer and she pays attention to details. The male voice, presumably Marcus, responded, "What about after Robert's gone? Will the daughter inherit everything?" That's what we need to find out. If she inherits significant assets, we might need to include her in our plans. Otherwise, she could become problematic. I stopped the recording, my hands shaking violently. They were planning to kill me too, if necessary. Your father realized the danger you'd be in after his death. That's why he created the secret inheritance and warned you to be careful about revealing it. Mr. Patterson's expression was grave. Irma, based on what your father discovered, you're currently living with a serial killer who views you as either an asset to exploit or an obstacle to eliminate. You need to decide how to handle this situation very carefully. As I drove home with Dad's research files hidden in my car, I felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on me. I could contact police, but would they believe such an extraordinary story without more concrete evidence? I could flee immediately, but that would leave Diane free to find her next victim. Or I could stay and gather the additional proof needed to ensure she faced justice for what she'd done to Dad and her previous husbands. It would be dangerous, but it might be the only way to prevent future murders. When I arrived home, Diane greeted me with her usual warm smile. "How was your day, sweetie?" Looking at her now, knowing what I knew, I could see the calculation behind her green eyes. Every gesture, every expression seemed like part of an elaborate performance designed to manipulate my emotions and lower my guard. "Fine," I managed to say, "just taking care of some errands." "Good. I've been thinking we should have a nice dinner together tonight. Just the two of us, like a real family. I'll cook your father's favorite recipe." As she moved toward the kitchen, I wondered if tonight would be the night she tried to poison me, too. But now I knew the truth, and I had Dad's research to guide me. The question was whether I could outmaneuver a woman who'd been perfecting her deadly skills for over 2 decades. The game had begun, but this time I had the advantage of knowing we were playing. Over the next 3 days, I threw myself into investigating Diane's deadly pattern with the same methodical approach I used in software debugging. Working during hours when she was out of the house, I researched her previous husband's deaths, more thoroughly cross-referencing obituaries with property records and insurance claims. The picture that emerged was even more chilling than Dad's initial research had revealed. Each husband had died within 6 months of updating his will to make Diane the primary beneficiary. Property transfers showed she'd inherited houses, investment accounts, and life insurance payouts totaling millions of dollars across her various marriages. More disturbing still, I found evidence she'd studied chemistry at community colleges under different names. Course transcripts showed classes in organic chemistry, toxicology, and pharmaceutical science. She'd been educating herself in the tools of murder. Through deep internet searches, I discovered that Diane Chen, Diane Wellington, Diane Morrison, and Diane Foster were all the same person, using variations of her identity to avoid detection between locations. Her real name appeared to be Diane Kruger, and she had a criminal record from the 1990s for insurance fraud. But the most terrifying discovery came when I found surveillance photos Dad had taken of Diane meeting with her mysterious accomplice, Marcus. The images showed a lean man in his 40s with short brown hair and cold eyes, always wearing expensive suits. Dad's notes identified him as Marcus Rivera, Diane's boyfriend, and partner in targeting wealthy, lonely men. According to Dad's investigation, Marcus worked as a grief counselor and financial planner positions that gave him access to vulnerable, recent widowers. His role was identifying potential targets and helping Diane make contact with them in settings where she'd appear sympathetic and available. Their system was diabolically efficient. Marcus would research wealthy men who'd recently lost their wives, learning about their assets, habits, and emotional vulnerabilities. He'd then arrange for Diane to encounter them in grief support groups, church functions, or community events where her own widow status would create instant common ground. The timeline showed they'd been operating together for over 15 years, moving across states after each successful murder, to avoid establishing patterns that might attract law enforcement attention. They were professional predators who'd refined their methods through decades of practice. As I absorbed this information, I realized I was dealing with far more than just Diane. Marcus was still actively involved in their operation, and he'd been the voice on the recorded phone calls discussing my potential elimination. This understanding became crucial on Friday evening when I noticed Marcus's car parked across the street from our house. Through Dad's hidden cameras, which I'd learned to access using his passwords, I watched him enter through the back door while Diane prepared dinner. "The daughter's been acting strange lately," I heard Diane tell Marcus in the kitchen. "More distant, asking fewer questions about finances. I wonder if she suspects something." "Maybe it's time to move to the next phase," Marcus replied. "You've been here almost 4 years longer than usual. The risk of exposure increases with time." I listened with growing dread as they discussed their concerns about me and their plans for the immediate future. "I've been gradually increasing the doses in her evening tea," Diane said casually, as if discussing seasoning adjustments. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make her feel confused and emotional, grief symptoms that would explain any unusual behavior. My blood turned to ice. I'd been drinking Diane's specially prepared tea every night for the past week, thinking she was being nurturing during my bereavement period. Instead, she'd been slowly poisoning me to make me more compliant and easier to manipulate. "How long before you're ready for the final step?" Marcus asked. "Soon. I need her to sign some financial documents first, supposedly to help me manage Robert's estate. Once I have access to her accounts and understand her complete financial picture, we can proceed." Marcus's voice became businesslike. "What about the disposal afterward? We'll need to make it look completely natural." "Suicide from grief over losing her father," Diane replied without hesitation. "I've been documenting her emotional instability, preparing a narrative about depression and financial stress. A distraught daughter overwhelmed by sudden loss takes her own life. Very believable." I backed away from the wall, my entire body shaking with terror and rage. These monsters had murdered my father and were now calmly planning my death as their next step in whatever elaborate financial scheme they were operating. But they'd made a crucial mistake by underestimating me. Unlike their previous victims, I discovered their true nature before they could complete their plan. And thanks to Dad's research and recording equipment, I had evidence of their crimes. I spent the weekend pretending to be increasingly depressed and confused while secretly documenting everything I could find about their operation. Using techniques from my cybersecurity background, I traced their digital footprints across multiple states and identities. The scope of their criminal network was staggering. They weren't just killing individual wealthy men. They were part of a larger organization that targeted vulnerable elderly people across the country. Marcus maintained contact with other teams operating similar schemes, sharing information about potential victims and successful methods. I found encrypted communications discussing a database of wealthy widowers updated regularly with information about their health family situations and asset valuations. They were operating like a corporation with territories, quotas, and performance metrics. Most chilling of all, I discovered they had a list of future targets already identified and researched. At least 6 other men were being prepared for approach by various female operatives in their network. Dad's death wasn't an isolated crime. It was part of an ongoing mass murder operation. By Sunday evening, I knew I had to act soon. Diane's poisoning schedule was escalating, and I could feel the effects becoming stronger each night. My thinking was becoming cloudier, my emotions more unstable. If I waited much longer, I might lose the mental clarity needed to execute a counterplan. More urgently, I'd overheard Diane tell Marcus they were planning to complete the project by Wednesday. That gave me less than 72 hours to gather final evidence and spring whatever trap I was going to set. As I lay in bed Sunday night, pretending to be sedated by her latest poisoning dose, I listened to Diane and Marcus finalize their timeline through the recording system. "We'll do it Tuesday evening," Diane said. "I'll give her the final dose during dinner, and she should be unconscious within 2 hours. Then we'll stage the suicide and call emergency services Wednesday morning." "What about physical evidence afterward?" Marcus asked. "I've already planted suicide notes on her laptop, supposedly written during moments of despair. Her fingerprints are on everything, and the timestamps will support the depression narrative. By Wednesday afternoon, we'll be ready to claim her assets and begin our exit strategy." Hearing them discuss my murder with such clinical detachment filled me with cold determination. They'd killed my father and were planning to kill me, but they'd underestimated the woman they were dealing with. I wasn't just Robert's grieving daughter. I was a software engineer with cybersecurity training access to all of Dad's research and nothing left to lose. If they wanted a fight, they'd pick the wrong target. Tuesday evening was going to be very different from what they expected. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable clarity both in the weather and in my mind. I'd spent the night fighting off the effects of Diane's latest poisoning by forcing myself to vomit after pretending to drink her special evening tea. The fog that had been clouding my thoughts for days finally lifted, replaced by sharp focus and cold determination. Diane greeted me at breakfast with her usual performance of loving concern. "You look pale, sweetie. Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired," I replied, noting how her eyes searched my face for signs of confusion or weakness. "Grief keeps me up at night." "I understand completely. Maybe I should make you a stronger sleeping tea tonight, something to help you rest more deeply." The casual way she suggested increasing my poisoning dose while smiling warmly made my skin crawl, but I maintained my facade of trust, even gratitude. "That would be wonderful, Diane. You've been taking such good care of me." Her smile widened with genuine pleasure at successfully manipulating my emotions. Family takes care of family. That's what Robert would have wanted. After she left for what she claimed was a grief counseling appointment, I activated Dad's hidden recording system and began my final evidence-gathering operation. Using skills from my cybersecurity background, I accessed the encrypted files on Marcus's laptop, which he'd foolishly connected to our home wireless network. What I found exceeded my worst expectations. Marcus maintained detailed profiles on dozens of wealthy targets across multiple states, including photographs, asset valuations, family situations, and psychological assessments. The files read like hunting guides for predators selecting their next prey. One folder contained communications with other operatives in their network, revealing at least 12 teams operating similar murder schemes nationwide. They had territories assigned like sales regions with monthly quotas and annual performance reviews. Murder had become their full-time profession. Most damning of all, I found video files Marcus had secretly recorded of previous operations. Footage showed Diane poisoning her husband's food and drink stage, managing their final illnesses, and even practicing her grief performances. She'd been documenting their crimes like trophies. The videos of Dad's final weeks were almost unbearable to watch. Footage showed Diane adding white powder to his medications, mixing liquid toxins into his soup, and carefully monitoring his declining condition while pretending to provide loving care. In one particularly horrific scene, Marcus and Diane discussed Dad's resistance to their timeline. "He's stronger than we expected," Marcus observed. "The doses that worked on Harold and Thomas aren't affecting Robert as quickly. His engineering background makes him more observant," Diane replied. "He's been asking questions about his symptoms that concern me. We might need to accelerate the process. What about increasing the digitalis concentration? Risky, but probably necessary. I'll add it to tomorrow's dinner. If he survives that dose, we'll know he suspects something." Watching them casually discuss murdering my father while he lay dying in the next room filled me with fury that threatened to overwhelm my careful planning. But I forced myself to remain focused on gathering evidence rather than acting on emotion. I copied everything onto multiple encrypted drives, uploaded files to secure cloud storage, and prepared comprehensive documentation packages for law enforcement. By afternoon, I had enough evidence to convict them of multiple murders across several states. But I also had a more personal goal. These monsters had made me watch my father suffer and die, thinking I was helping provide loving care when I was actually enabling his murder. They'd stolen my chance to properly say goodbye to him, corrupted my memories of his final months, and planned to kill me as their next step. Prison was too good for them. I wanted them to experience the fear and helplessness their victims had felt. So I began preparing my own trap. Using Dad's electronics workshop in the basement, I modified his hidden recording system to broadcast live video feeds to multiple recipients, including law enforcement contacts and news organizations. When Diane and Marcus made their final move, the entire world would be watching. I also prepared several surprises designed to turn their own methods against them. While they planned to poison me Tuesday evening, I was ready to ensure they'd be the ones losing consciousness instead. Tuesday afternoon brought an unexpected wrinkle when Marcus arrived early and began helping Diane prepare for the evening's activities. Through the hidden cameras, I watched them lay out syringes, measuring cups and bottles of clear liquid that I now knew contained the same toxins that had killed my father. "Everything needs to be perfect tonight," Diane said, checking items off a written list. "One mistake could expose our entire operation." "The daughter suspects nothing," Marcus assured her. "I watched her through the window this morning and she still seems confused and trusting. The cognitive effects are working exactly as planned." They spent an hour rehearsing the evening's timeline, practicing how they'd administer the final dose and stage my suicide. Their clinical attention to detail revealed just how many times they'd performed this routine. "Remember to check for a pulse after 30 minutes. Diane instructed Marcus. Thomas took longer than expected to stop breathing, and Harold actually regained consciousness briefly. We can't have any surprises this time. What about disposal of the evidence afterward? I'll clean the kitchen thoroughly while you position the body. We need ligature marks on her neck to support the hanging narrative, but nothing that suggests a struggle. Listening to them plan my murder while discussing technique improvements from previous kills pushed me past rational planning into cold rage. These weren't just criminals. They were monsters who'd refined torture and murder into an art form. But their overconfidence was about to become their downfall. At 6 p.m., Diane called me to dinner with her usual warm enthusiasm. "I made your father's favorite recipe tonight, sweetie, pot roast with all the vegetables he loved." The dining room table was set with our best china and candles, creating an atmosphere of intimate family celebration. To any outside observer, this would look like a loving stepmother providing comfort during her stepdaughter's grieving process. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated murder scene. "This is beautiful, Diane. Thank you for taking such good care of me," I said, playing my role perfectly. "It's my pleasure, darling. You're all the family I have left now." As we ate, Diane maintained cheerful conversation about memories of Dad and plans for our future together. Her performance was flawless, mixing just enough sadness about recent loss with hope for moving forward. But I noticed Marcus moving quietly through the house, checking escape routes and positioning equipment for the evening's activities. They were both playing their roles while preparing for murder. "I made special tea for dessert," Diane announced after we finished eating. "Something to help you sleep peacefully tonight." She returned from the kitchen carrying a delicate china cup filled with steaming liquid that smelled of chamomile and honey. I knew this was the moment they'd been building toward. "You're too good to me," I said, accepting the cup with trembling hands. "Family takes care of family," she repeated, watching my face intently as I raised the cup toward my lips. This was the moment of truth. But instead of drinking the poison tea, I was about to spring the trap that would end their murder spree forever. To Dad's memory, I said, lifting the cup in a toast. To Robert, Diane agreed, raising her own water glass. As I brought the cup to my lips, I caught Marcus's eye through the kitchen doorway. He was holding a syringe and wearing latex gloves, ready to assist if the poison didn't work fast enough. But they had no idea that their careful plans were about to explode in their faces. I pretended to take a small sip of the poison tea, then set the cup down with shaking hands. "Actually, I'm feeling a bit nauseated. Could I save this for later?" Diane's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, though she maintained her concerned smile. "Of course, dear. Sometimes grief affects the stomach. Why don't you rest on the sofa while I clean up?" "That sounds perfect," I replied, moving toward the living room while secretly activating the modified recording system with my phone. Unknown to Diane and Marcus, every moment from this point forward was being broadcast live to FBI offices in 6 states, along with local police departments and major news organizations. The evidence packages I'd prepared were automatically releasing to multiple recipients. As I settled onto the couch, I heard Diane and Marcus whispering urgently in the kitchen. "She didn't drink enough," Marcus hissed. "The dose was calculated for complete consumption." "We'll have to use the backup method," Diane replied grimly. "Prepare the syringe with the concentrated solution." I closed my eyes and controlled my breathing to simulate the early stages of sedation, while mentally preparing for what would come next. Through years of martial arts training in college, I'd learned to regulate my heart rate and muscle tension to appear unconscious while remaining alert. "Is she out?" Marcus asked softly. "Not yet, but she's fading. Look at her breathing pattern." I felt Diane approach and lean over me, checking for signs of consciousness. Her fingers pressed against my wrist, measuring my pulse, while she studied my face for any indication of awareness. "Perfect," she murmured. "She's exactly where we need her." Over the next 20 minutes, I listened as they prepared for what they believed would be my murder. They discussed positioning my body timing for emergency calls and cleanup procedures with the same casual tone others might use for planning a dinner party. "Remember, we need tears when the paramedics arrive," Diane instructed Marcus. "I'll be the devastated stepmother who tried everything to help her stepdaughter through depression." "What about the suicide note timing?" "I'll find it on her laptop tomorrow, supposedly written during tonight's emotional breakdown. The timestamp will show she wrote it just before taking her life." Their attention to detail revealed decades of experience in staging deaths to appear natural or self-inflicted. No wonder law enforcement had never connected their previous crimes. But their overconfidence was making them careless. They assumed I was helpless, just another victim following their established pattern. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who'd inherited Dad's analytical mind and investigative skills. "Time to finish this," Marcus said, approaching with what I assumed was the fatal syringe. That's when I opened my eyes and smiled. "Hello, Marcus, Diane, I've been waiting for you." The shock on their faces was immediate and total. Marcus stumbled backward, dropping the syringe, while Diane's mask of loving concern shattered completely. "That's impossible," Diane gasped. "You drank the tea. I watched you." "I pretended to drink your poison just like I've been pretending to trust you for the past week," I said, sitting up calmly. "But unlike your previous victims, I knew exactly what you were planning." I pulled out my phone and showed them the live broadcast screen. "Say hello to the FBI, the Colorado State Police, and about 50,000 people watching this stream online." Marcus lunged toward me, but I was ready. Years of martial arts training kicked in as I rolled away from his attack and struck his knee with a devastating kick that dropped him to the floor screaming. Diane tried to run for the back door, but I'd anticipated that escape route. The electronic locks I'd installed using Dad's home automation system engaged, automatically trapping them inside. "You killed my father," I said, advancing on Diane as she pressed herself against the locked door. "You made me watch him suffer and die while I thought I was helping care for him. You corrupted every memory I have of his final months." "You don't understand," Diane pleaded desperately. "Robert was already dying. The cancer would have killed him anyway. We just made it easier." "Easier for you to inherit his money, you mean?" Marcus was still writhing on the floor, his knee clearly broken. "This won't stand up in court," he gasped. "Everything you have is illegally obtained." Actually, everything was legally obtained by my father before his death, I replied, pulling out the evidence drives I'd prepared, including recordings of you two planning multiple murders, discussing your previous victims, and detailing your methods. The sound of sirens filled the air as emergency responders arrived. Through the front window, I could see police cars, ambulances, and FBI vehicles surrounding the house. "You're both under arrest for the murders of Robert Hayes, Thomas Wellington, Harold Chen, and at least 4 other men across multiple states," I announced as law enforcement officers entered through the front door I'd unlocked remotely. Diane made one final attempt at manipulation, dropping to her knees with tears streaming down her face. "Please, Irma, I really did love your father. Everything got so complicated, but my feelings for him were real." Looking down at this woman who'd tortured my father to death while pretending to love him, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "Save it for your trial. The jury will love watching the videos where you and Marcus discuss which poison works fastest." As FBI agents handcuffed them, both Diane's facade finally cracked completely. The elegant, grief-stricken widow disappeared, replaced by the cold-eyed predator she'd always been underneath. "You think you're so smart," she snarled at me. "But you have no idea how many people we've killed or how long our organization has been operating. Taking us down won't stop anything." "Maybe not," I agreed, "but it's a start." Agent Sarah Martinez, who'd been coordinating the multi-state investigation into their murder network, approached me as paramedics treated Marcus's shattered knee. "Ms. Hayes, the evidence you provided is going to break this case wide open. We've been tracking similar patterns across 12 states for the past 5 years, but we could never prove the connections." "My father did most of the investigative work," I replied. "I just finished what he started." As they loaded Diane and Marcus into separate police vehicles, I felt a profound sense of completion. Dad's warning had saved my life, and his research was about to bring justice not just for his murder, but for dozens of other victims across the country. The nightmare that had begun with a secret inheritance was finally over, but more importantly, the predators who'd stolen my father's life were going to pay for their crimes. Standing in the doorway of the house where Dad had been murdered, watching his killers face justice, I finally understood his final gift to me. He'd given me not just financial security, but the tools and knowledge needed to expose a nationwide murder conspiracy. His death hadn't been in vain after all. 6 months later, I stood in the packed courthouse as Judge Williams delivered the final sentences in what had become known as the Black Widow Network case. Diane received 5 consecutive life sentences without parole for the murders of Dad Thomas Wellington, Harold Chen, and 2 other victims we'd identified through her documentation. Marcus got 4 life sentences plus 50 years for his role as accomplice and network coordinator. More importantly, information from his computers had led to arrests of 17 other operatives across 12 states, dismantling an organization that had been murdering elderly victims for over 20 years. The systematic nature of these crimes represents a level of calculated evil rarely seen in American courtrooms. Judge Williams stated during sentencing, "The defendants showed no remorse for the lives they destroyed or the families they shattered through their greed." As I watched Diane being led away in shackles, I felt a deep sense of closure. The woman who'd fooled my father and nearly fooled me was facing the consequences of decades of murder and manipulation. But the most meaningful moment came afterward when victims' families approached me in the courthouse hallway. Thomas Wellington's daughter thanked me for proving her father hadn't died naturally. Harold Chen's son wept as he described years of wondering why his healthy father had suddenly deteriorated. "You gave us answers we never thought we'd get," said Margaret Morrison, whose father had been one of Diane's earlier victims. "For 15 years we've lived with questions about his death. Now we finally have peace." That's when I realized Dad's inheritance had given me something far more valuable than money. It had provided the opportunity to transform personal tragedy into protection for others. Using the $6 million inheritance, I established the Robert Hayes Foundation for Elder Protection, dedicated to investigating suspicious deaths among vulnerable elderly populations and educating families about predatory relationship warning signs. The Foundation's first initiative created a national database linking unusual death patterns across state lines, filling the information gap that had allowed Diane's network to operate undetected for decades. We partnered with medical examiners, law enforcement agencies, and elder advocacy groups to share information about potential predators. Our education program reached thousands of families, teaching them to recognize signs of financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, and gradual poisoning that characterize predatory caregiving relationships. We distributed wallet-sized cards listing warning signs and emergency contact numbers. Most importantly, we funded investigation into hundreds of suspicious deaths that had been prematurely ruled natural or accidental. In the first year alone, our work led to reopening 47 cases, resulting in 12 additional arrests and convictions. The Foundation also provided legal support for families seeking justice for elderly relatives who died under questionable circumstances. Many families lacked resources to challenge official death determinations or pursue wrongful death claims against predators who'd inherited their loved ones' assets. Through this work, I discovered that Dad's murder had been part of an epidemic of elder abuse affecting thousands of American families. Predators like Diane specifically targeted the most vulnerable members of our society, exploiting their loneliness, grief, and trust to steal both their wealth and their lives. But I also found tremendous hope in the families who refused to accept convenient explanations for their loved ones' deaths. Like me, they demanded answers and fought for justice, despite overwhelming odds. 1 year after the trials, I moved back into Dad's house, which I'd converted into the Foundation's headquarters. Walking through rooms where he'd been slowly murdered, I felt his presence guiding my work toward protecting others from similar fates. The basement workshop where he'd conducted his investigation became our research center, filled with computers analyzing death patterns and financial irregularities. The kitchen where Diane had prepared poisoned meals now hosted support group meetings for families affected by elder abuse. I met Detective James Sullivan during one of our joint investigations into suspicious deaths in Denver. He'd been working elder abuse cases for 8 years, feeling frustrated by how often predators escape justice through jurisdictional complications and insufficient evidence. Your foundation's database connected 3 deaths I'd been investigating separately. He told me over dinner at the restaurant where Dad used to take me for birthday celebrations. Without that information sharing, I never would have seen the pattern. Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared commitment to protecting vulnerable people rather than romantic chemistry. But gradually, I found myself looking forward to our investigative collaborations and evening conversations about challenging cases. You've turned personal trauma into something that's saving lives across the country, James said one evening as we watched the sunset from Dad's back porch. Your father would be incredibly proud. Through our work together, I learned that Dad's analytical approach to problems could be applied not just to engineering and investigation, but to building meaningful relationships. James understood my need to honor Dad's memory through continued advocacy work, just as I respected his dedication to seeking justice for elderly victims. 2 years after Diane's conviction, the foundation had grown into a nationally recognized organization with offices in 6 states and partnerships with law enforcement agencies across the country. Our work had led to over 100 arrests and prevented countless future crimes through education and early intervention. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when I received a letter from a woman in Oregon whose father had been saved by our warning signs checklist. My father had recently started dating a woman who seemed too good to be true, she wrote. After reading your foundation's materials, I recognized several red flags in her behavior. When we investigated her background, we discovered she was wanted in connection with 3 suspicious deaths in other states. Your work literally saved my father's life. Standing in Dad's office, surrounded by thank you letters from families we'd helped, I finally understood the full meaning of his final gift to me. The $6 million had been important for establishing financial security and funding our mission. But his real inheritance had been the lesson that love sometimes requires keeping painful secrets to protect those we care about most. Dad had hidden his investigation and inheritance not from lack of trust, but from tremendous love. He'd sacrificed his own desire to share the burden in order to ensure I'd survive to seek justice for his murder and protection for future victims. His secrecy had been an act of faith in my strength and intelligence, a belief that I could handle the responsibility of continuing his work even when facing seemingly impossible odds. Now, as I prepare to expand the Foundation's reach to every state in the country I carry forward, not just Dad's money, but his commitment to using analytical thinking and careful investigation to protect people who can't protect themselves. Have you ever noticed warning signs in a relationship that seem too good to be true? Sometimes our instincts recognize dangers our minds want to dismiss, especially when we're dealing with grief or loneliness. I'd love to hear your thoughts about recognizing manipulation in close relationships. Thank you for letting me share Dad's story and the Foundation's mission with you. If this message resonates with you, please like this video and subscribe to help us reach more families who might benefit from this information. Share it with anyone who has elderly relatives or knows someone dealing with recent loss. Together, we can build the kind of protective community Dad envisioned when he left me that final life-saving warning. Your support helps us honor the memory of every victim while building a safer future for vulnerable people everywhere.